ask you more of the point that you, well, on Ambedkar's relationship to Marx, and particularly because some kind of notion of structure and mechanicity is also, of course, in Marx, and also this notion of a disintegrative mechanism.
Yes.
And some relation to telos and inevitability and so on. So there seem to be lots of points. I just wanted to know more about how you read that.
No, I mean actually, you've asked, and this is what I was worried about, this is what I was warning about, that, I mean, this is really very much honestly a work in progress, and the truth of the matter is that I don't have an adequate answer to the question of what's the relation between Ambedkar and Marx. I mean, I have an answer to the question of what's the relation between Ambedkar and the early Marx, right? But that's not what is at work here. Here, there's a question of the relation between Ambedkar and the mature Marx, because the question of class is being invoked here in a different way. Yeah. And in a sense, Ambedkar has not worked out this relationship himself. But what I'd like to really stress is that, capital is a machine tool, right? And I think part of what is involved in much of the shift that's taken place in the way we think of capitalism is an emphasis on machinicity rather than structures. Yeah. And so there is a certain parallel here, again. And what I'd also really like to really stress is that I think this is absolutely revolutionary. This thinking of it as two inequalities rather than hierarchy and inequality. Because then the question, you entirely change the terrain of the argument. Yeah? So I know that's not really an answer.
Thanks.
My question is sort of related to my own discipline, which is literature. When you talked about imitation, are you also thinking of, and you didn't present the entire thing, of course, that's why I'm curious. Are you also thinking of the Greek idea of mimesis? Let's say, for instance, Plato and Aristotle engaging with the idea of imitation in very different ways. Are you also looking at them? Yes, how?
Eventually, I want to, but I think that I suspect that Ambedkar's explicit influence here is Tarde. And the interesting thing about Tarde is that Tarde does actually provide, a concept of the social organized around imitation, right? Or around repetition, to talk of the way Deleuze reworks this trope. So there's a different kind of work being done. So I said that I would like to explore this a bit more and get back to this. Yeah. So that's what I said. Half the questions I'll have to say I don't know.
No, that's all right.
That's a good strategy. Alf, Valerian, and Alf, Valerian, Isabel.
Okay, Ajay, I was really fascinated by the way that you started by outlining the way that Ambedkar thinks the social, because it's obviously a radical way of thinking the social that is revolutionary as being sort of, being shot through with power relations that need to be overturned in order for caste inequalities to cease. That contrasts very much with the argument that Rupa Vishwanath makes in her recent book, The Pariah Problem, about how caste came to be defined both by missionaries and by the colonial state as a social problem, social then being extracted from power relations based on property and so on and so forth, therefore also defined as a problem that could be remedied through, should we call them merely cultural strategies. That is, that it's a problem that do not require the kind of radical strategies that Ambedkar is thinking about. So I'm wondering then if that suggests that Ambedkar is thinking against the grain of the way in which untouchability and caste have come to be constituted within that discourse which emerged from the late 19th century to the first half of the 20th century in missionary and colonial practice and discourse.
I think he's very much is, and I think what I'd like to stress once again is the two senses of the social and the two senses of the political. Right? One of these senses can be, as a shorthand, described as a liberal sense of the liberal vision of the social and the political, right? Where the social and the political are two different domains. The political is a realm of the rights of citizen, where I am a political quote-unquote man, and the social is the realm of the rights of man, right? And the rights of man are essentially private, right? And of course, as you know, the social occupies, as Ajay points out, a kind of curious position between public and private. But to the extent that the social is governed by the rights of man, then if there is caste discrimination, that is a social problem to be dealt with through legislation maybe, but it's also a private problem, right? So caste discrimination becomes a private issue, or it can be regarded as a private issue. Yeah? So there is that right-wing liberalism, which would say that caste is a private issue. There is a more progressive liberalism that would still say that, look, the social needs to be remade. But we're still working with the rights of man, rights of citizen, dichotomy. Yeah? What is interesting is the second sense of the social and political, right? Where the social names all of society. Yeah? And the political names the principle of equality. Yeah? And now, of course, there can be, and there have been ever since the phrase the social question came into being, there has been, which is, I think, mid-19th century or something, right? There has been a certain kind of way in which liberalism is not entirely innocent of this distinction. But I would say what is distinctive about the revolutionary movement is precisely that it sticks to and insists on this way of thinking of the social movement. Right? And that is what Ambedkar is doing. Without ever giving up on the first one completely, but using the second one to destabilize the first one. Right? So in that sense, he is working with a very different framework. And he is certainly destabilizing the missionary understanding. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. I'm glad I at least had one question I could answer.
Ajay, thank you for this excellent layout of the I just wanted to ask a couple of clarifications. See that formula, caste is an enclosed class, is straight away taken from Maxwell. And he puts it in the italics in the text.
Yes.
And then later on, when he actually began to invoke division of labor and therefore classes, again, he uses it in a very different sense than in the way Marx would have used it.
Yes.
And it's much more variant in terms of the distinctions that he makes between division of labor and class. So would you like to comment a little on the impact of Weber in this experiment?
Yes, that's actually a great question. And it's something that I'm actually working out right now. You see, this is also very interesting.
Sorry about this clarification. Because I'm told, and I might be mistaken in this, that Weber reaches Colombia, in the sense Weber becomes influential in Colombia only from 1919. And the essay is written in 1970. So we see a palpable impact if this is right, because you cannot explain this formula in italics without recourse to Weber. So can you do some kind of a genealogy of this Weberian kind?
Sure. Was it? Yeah. Sure. Again, I have to claim that I'm beginning. Right? I think there is certainly a connection here, but I have not traced out the connection well enough. What I would like to suggest is also an additional connection, right, which may be interesting also for the way that is taken up, right, which is Durkheim. Because don't forget, Durkheim and Tade are opponents, right? They are fierce opponents. In fact, Durkheim supplants Tade, and Durkheim. We don't know whether Ambedkar has read Durkheim at this stage, but it would be very surprising if he has not. Somebody, 1890s, Durkheim is already attacking Tade, and Tade is attacking Durkheim. And it's unlikely that you are exposed to an extensive research course of readings on Tade without at least having something to do with the people, with his most prominent critics. Right? So I would say that one of the interesting things about Ambedkar is, and this is the way that this is connected to Weber, is that I think it's possible to argue that there's a connection between Weber and Durkheim. Right? So that there is a, not necessarily, there is a kind of intellectual affinity between the two. What is intriguing, therefore, it seems to me, is that unlike say, for example, you say study good, Durkheim bad, right?
So can everyone at the back hear him?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So starting, and unlike that, he's trying to affirm both of them. And to my mind, that is perhaps connected to the way he's trying to affirm both mechanism and machine. Yeah? Because you can think of Durkheim and Weber as thinkers of mechanism. You can think of Tarde as a thinker of machine. And in a sense, this may be actually one of the most interesting things that makes him so interesting and that makes him so productive as a thinker. But more than that at this stage, I don't feel I can say.
Isabel?
Thank you very much for really a very suggestive talk. It's a question, I just wondered, is Ambedkar interested in what becomes of caste in the diaspora? And it sort of seems to me it raises a series of interesting questions because, I really don't know a lot about Ambedkar, so take it from whence it comes, but he strikes me very much as a comparative thinker.
He is very much.
So
yes.
I heard a very interesting paper actually by Revati's Krishnaswamy, who refers to him as a trans-modern thinker.
Uh-huh.
And it's very much putting things next to each other. And I suppose it goes to this question of what is the whole?
Yes.
And it appears very much from what you were saying, and is the whole only India? Or is there something in Ambedkar's thought that can actually speak to our concern today, which is much more about the connection rather than just the comparison? Because it seems also, the problem, of course, with the race and caste debate is that it also sets up a kind of, the quotes that you had from Ambedkar were slightly uneasy.
Mm-hmm.
That there's the quote-unquote primitive tribe who is geographically isolated,
Mm-hmm.
and thereby implicitly there is some sort of scale
Right.
of kind of social value being constructed there.
Yes, yes. No, actually that is one of the most troubling aspects of Ambedkar, this trope of primitive tribe. So I completely agree with you that there. But I also think of it as something that is connected to the way that culture persists in Ambedkar's thinking. As a kind of both rejected for the questions that most matter to him, but not explicitly rejected. Right? And and I think there are problems associated with that. Yeah. The other question is the first question you asked, which has to do with the whole and connections. Right? I think what we could take from Ambedkar today would be slightly, if you think of Ambedkar as a thinker for today, obviously the whole that we would work with would not be the whole that Ambedkar works with. Right? But I do think that a whole is not opposed to the emphasis on connections. Right? The whole is in some senses the domain within which the questions of social justice can be asked, right? Or questions of justice arise. So wherever a question of justice can be raised, a whole comes into being. Right? So it's not as though, what I'm trying to say is that Ambedkar works with two notions of the whole. Right? One, a implicit erased cultural notion of the whole, and two, a much more explicit concept of the whole based around justice. Right? And so, if a whole is created by justice, then the question of which whole gets a very different answer from the answer you give if a whole is created by culture. Does that kind of, yeah?
Yeah, Becky?
Thank you for helping to trigger off a whole series of questions in my mind. I was just wondering how, what Ambedkar says about structure versus the machine, and the way in which that leads to a kind of inevitability, and how that could be linked from caste to race. And I'm thinking of Biko. And I wonder if anyone
Steve
else...
Biko.
Steve Biko, if anyone else would like to perhaps follow that train of thought. So Biko also talks about the inevitability of history, but we're not trapped in history, and how we then develop a consciousness
Yes.
against that history that we
Yes. Yes.
schooled in.
Yes, I think, well, one way of entering this question is to say that, first of all, that I don't think Ambedkar ever explicitly makes a contrast with structure. Right? In fact, I don't think Ambedkar even explicitly ever says that machine is the way I think the book. But I think we can, as readers, that's part of what we do as readers, right? We don't necessarily focus on what's most explicit, but we also try and trace our implicit tropes. So I think, in some senses, one has to read this distinction between structure and machine. When you read, it's only through reading that distinction emerges. Second, I think what is crucial about the machine is repetition. And this repetition produces, and it's because it's a Tardian machine. Right? It's not a machine in the more conventional sense. This machine produces difference. So a machine that produces difference in the very process of repetition. At this point, Ambedkar has not thought the question of redemption, or even if he has thought it, he has not written about it. Yeah? I think it's unlikely that he's not thought it, right?
But it's to object or to refuse self-othering.
To say that where would this difference lead
Yes.
to for the figure of the untouchable, right? Because the untouchable is exactly the figure who is, produced by difference, but must also reject this difference,
Yes,
or must wreck this machine,
yes,
right? Or must wreck the caste machine, so to speak.
yes.
So I would say that I don't know enough Biko to draw an analogy, but I would say that in some senses, the metaphor of machine may be equally powerful for thinking race as for thinking caste. So, and that's a very preliminary kind of.
Gopal?
Thank you, Ajay, for your presentation. I thought I would just request you to, I would start, don't mind.
Please.
Yeah, you will have to. If you are trying to understand caste in India and the mechanical development, and then you have these obvious references coming from the West and actually interfering with the logic of Ambedkar's thinking. Now, we have to ask this question, what is the structure of the discourse existed around that point of 1913 to 16? Now, the question is, Ambedkar is actually doing thinking politically. So he will pick up references that are structurally bound. Structurally bound. They are the structure of caste.
Yes.
He'll always have Brahmanism as the reference point,
Yes.
not Weber and not any other. Okay? So therefore, what is there for Ambedkar is S.V. Ketkar, who writes his Caste in India in 1909. Though Gandhi writes Swaraj also at the same time, Ambedkar doesn't bother about it. Okay? So, caste or enclosed classes is from there. Therefore, he goes, Weber doesn't have anything to do with this. Ambedkar picks up this from there. So there is a lot of influence of Ketkar on Ambedkar in terms of
Yes,
this
Ketkar extensively.
Caste are included, but then there are later scholars like Sharad Patil and Gale Albert. They say this is a mechanical understanding of materialism. Okay? And to which some of us also responded differently. So the question is, the dialectic of Brahmanism will not, and Casteism will not allow, and just to make this point very forcefully, Ambedkar is historically bound to follow Ketkar because he is born into a question created by Brahmanism.
Yes.
So how can he say answers from elsewhere? That's the whole point actually when one thinks about it. And secondly, small point is about